Hello, fellow adventurers, and welcome back to another episode of Word Safari. In the last couple of episodes, we have been looking at different Indo-European roots, most of which have had something to do with thinking or knowing. And so I figured we would keep going on that same theme and look at another Indo-European root that is also intimately connected to knowing, thinking, and knowledge. That root is the root men. What does the root men mean? Well, the fundamental verbal meaning of that root is to think. So again, this is a great root to talk about on the heels of roots like wade and know that we have recently been looking at. As a verb, this root means to think, but as a noun, it can mean mind, because of course your mind is what you think with. Now, most ancient cultures did not know that the brain was the seat of thinking, and different cultures had different theories as to what organs we used to think with or to be conscious with. So mind and brain are not necessarily the same thing, but of course, all cultures knew that we thought with something because everybody was thinking just like we are today. So they all have a word for something like the mind, and they have a word for something like the brain too, but it may not necessarily be closely connected for them. So we're specifically talking about the mind, what you think with here, wherever that might be located in your body. We know where it is today. So mind, of course, comes from the men root, and you can see the min hiding out there, not really hiding very well, in the first three letters of that four-letter word. This is our most common native Germanic word from the men root. For most of the rest of our excursion today, we're going to be looking at other words from other Indo-European languages that we have borrowed into Greek, but our word mind is a great place to start because it is a native Germanic word. We inherited it from Indo-European. We did not borrow it from anyone. Now, another verb that comes from this root that has something to do with the mind and thinking can be illustrated by this next word that we have in English, and that is to remind. You may have noticed this just because it's so obvious within English that remind comes from mind. If you remind somebody of something, you're putting something back in their mind because the meaning of that prefix re is back or again, and that's essentially what you're doing. The interesting thing about our English word remind is it's actually kind of a hybrid word because mind is a Germanic word, but re comes from the Latin prefix re. So we borrowed re, but we inherited mind, and then we stuck them together and made this word remind because we're basically just treating re like our own prefix at this point, even though it was originally a borrowing from Latin. So there are lots of words in various Indo-European languages, not just English, that come from the men root that have something to do with reminding somebody of something or putting something into their mind or making them think about something. So we're going to see some of those as we go on throughout this excursion today. Let's start with some Latin compounds. Since we get so many words in English from Latin, of course, Latin is a good place to start. The Latin word for mind was mens or mentis. So it had a T on the end of it, just like our word mind has a D on the end of it. It's a similar process in Indo-European. So you take the men root, you put this T suffix, you can make a noun out of it. So this meant word in Latin, that's the root before you put the ending on it. We get a lot of things from this in English. Words like mental. Mental just, of course, has something to do with the mind, and it comes from this Latin word mentalis that literally just means of the mind. It's not very complicated, and of course, we use it that way today in English. Of course, we get the noun mentality from this as well. Your mentality is your state of mind. What other words do we get from this ment root in Latin that comes from the men root, just like our word mind does? How about mention? You may not have thought of the connection here, but mention actually just comes from a Latin word mentio that means a calling to mind, an instance of somebody calling something to mind. And that's all it means. When you mention something, you're bringing it into the mind of everybody who is listening to you. So pretty cool, right? Once you see that. How about memento? A memento, this comes from the Latin word memento. We literally just stole this word out of Latin. And this one's a little bit strange because we didn't actually steal a noun out of Latin to use as a noun, because memento is a noun in English, of course. We actually stole a verb, and not just any verb, but memento is an imperative verb in Latin. It's something you tell somebody and say, remember this, memento this. That's how you use it in Latin, but we have stolen it into English as a noun, and now it's something that brings the past back to mind. Some keepsake or something you get from somewhere might be a memento, right? But of course, it has the ment there in the middle, and it has this extra syllable at the beginning that is what we call reduplication, which means you take the first syllable and you reduplicate it, or you copy it and you say it again. And this is a pretty common process across the Indo-European languages for a number of reasons. What else do we get from the Latin stem ment? You can make a lot of compounds. nouns out of this. In other words, by putting some kind of preposition at the beginning. So we get get a word like dementia from this. Dementia just comes from the Latin prefix de, which means away from, and we see it all over the place on other words in English as well, plus the ment stem. So literally, dementia means to be away from your mind or to be out of your mind. I mean, that's the literal meaning of dementia, although today we don't normally use it to mean craziness. We use it to mean, there's just something physiologically wrong with your mind and your memory's not quite working the way that it once did. What's another word we get from this? You might not have seen this one coming, but how about comment? Comment actually comes from this with another prefix, the prefix comb. Sometimes you see it as cone. We have some assimilation here, the N becoming an M before the M. So that's why there's two M's there in comment. So a comment literally just means something that is thought together, or in English we might say thought up, and that was the original meaning of this word. In Latin, it was an invention or something you come up with, and then we kind of expanded the semantic sphere of this as the years went on. So it's not just something you come up with in your mind, but it's also something that you then share with other people. And today, that's what a comment is. You come up with something, some idea or something in your head, you put it together in your mind, and then you spit it out with your mouth. And that's essentially what a comment is today in English. But it started out meaning something more like an invention or something you come up with, and you can see the etymological pieces there. Let's look at some more Latin derivatives from the men root, maybe not with the T on the end, but definitely still from the men root. What about a word like reminisce? You can see that I've split it up there. The re, we've already talked about that, means back or again. The min is from the men root, just the vowel's a little bit different. And then you have a verbal suffix here that we don't need to worry about too much. It comes from the Latin verb reminisci, which just means to recall to mind. You can see the re right there. It means to remind yourself of something, to remember something. And of course, we use it maybe a little bit differently, but not too much. This is a verb that specifically means to bring the past to mind when you're reminiscing about old times or whatever, maybe with your friends. How about Minerva? If you know anything about Roman mythology, you know who the goddess Minerva was or is. You can see the min there right at the beginning of her name. Who was Minerva? She was the Roman goddess of wisdom. And if you know about the connections with Greek mythology, of course, the Romans harmonized a lot of their gods with the Greeks. So Minerva is the equivalent of the Greek goddess Athena, who, of course, was similarly known for being a goddess of wisdom and a goddess of using her mind. So it's actually a very appropriate name for Minerva, that she has the men root right in her name because she really is the mind goddess, and so it kind of works out. Let's kind of stay on that same path there. We were just talking about Roman mythology. How about Greek mythology? We're going to use this as a segue to look at some Greek words now that we've looked at some Latin words. What elements of Greek mythology might come from the men root? How about mentor? If you've read the works of Homer, you might be familiar with the character Mentor. He's older, he's wiser, he's kind of an advisor, and that's probably actually what his name means because the men root is, again, right there at the beginning of his name. The tor thing at the end is actually just an Indo-European suffix that we call an agent suffix. It is somebody who does the first part. So a mentor literally just means a thinker, a minder, somebody who uses their mind for something. So you can see how this name would have originally meant counselor or advisor or somebody who thinks of things and then, it gives you advice about them or whatever. Again, it's a proper name in the works of Homer. That just happens to be this person's name. But of course, today we have stolen it and used it and made it not a proper name. You can just have a mentor. That person doesn't have to be named mentor for them to be your mentor, as you probably know. So we use this today as a common noun that just means an advisor or counselor or an older, wiser person who is going to help you throughout life. Let's look at some other Greek derivatives. Now, a lot of these Greek derivatives are going to be in what we call the zero grade from an Indo-European perspective. I don't want to get too technical, but all that means is that the vowel in the middle of the root is not there anymore. That E vowel in men, and by the way, Indo-European roots normally have E vowels in them, like gen and wade. We've seen Gano is a little weird, but we don't need to get into that. Most Indo-European roots do have an E vowel as the default, but there are times when the E vowel might not be there. It might just drop out sometimes, and so when the E vowel drops out, you just get N. You get M and N smashed together, and the E isn't even there anymore. And that happens a lot of times in Greek with words and with words that we get from Greek, like mnemonic. Of course, today in English, we don't like pronouncing M and N at the beginning of a word, and so we just make the M silent. But in Greek, they did not make the M silent. They actually would have pronounced this word mnemonikos. They actually said mne, mnemonikos like that. So they actually said it the way that it is pronounced, even if we don't do it in English anymore. Of course, as you know, a mnemonic is something that you use to help you remember something, and it just comes from this Greek word mnemonikos, meaning pertaining to memory, essentially. And that's how we use it, right? It's a way to remember something, and we do technically use it as an adjective, just like the Greeks did. A mnemonic device. It's an adjective, what kind of device it is, right? But it's pertaining to memory. How about some other things we get from Greek that have the men root, maybe with the e gone, so it's just mn something. How about amnesia? Now we don't drop the m here because there's something at the beginning that allows us to keep the m there and pronounce it the way we like to pronounce things in English. So you have amnesia. This comes from the Greek word amnesia. Is just a Greek a prefix that means not. So plus the men root means not remembering, which means forgetting. So as a noun, amnesia means forgetfulness. And of course, when we use this word today in English, amnesia is just the condition of not remembering or not being able to remember something. A very closely related term in both English and Greek, even though you may never have juxtaposed them because we don't really use them together at all today in the English language, is amnesty. Amnesty and amnesia are very closely related to each other, as you can see when you put them next to each other. Amnesty comes from the Greek word amnestia, so it's very similar in Greek too, which also means forgetfulness or oblivion or not remembering. But of course, we use it in a different context because today amnesty is more like an official forgetfulness of crimes or wrongdoing or misdeeds or something like that. But it does have that men root hiding right there in the middle of it, except the e in the middle of the men root is gone, so you just get the mn part going on there. What are some more Greek derivatives? How about automatic? Now you might be like, wait, this doesn't really look like the men root. Where is the men root here? Well, actually, it's also hiding in the middle, but there's one more thing you need to know, and that is that when you drop the E out of the men root in Indo-European and then put a consonant after it, like you have here in automatic, what would happen is the N would become a vowel, like in our English word button. And I realize depending on your dialect of English, you might not pronounce that the same way. In American English, we say button, like a button on your shirt or something like that. And that think of that in button. That's actually a vowel. In linguistic terminology, we call that a vocalic N. It's actually a vowel, essentially. Indo-Europeans did the same thing. So they would have said automuntic, not automuntic. I mean, it's even hard to make as a consonant once you drop the vowel out anyways. So they would have said, in a phonological context like this, mun, mun. However, in Greek, they got tired of saying for whatever reason, and they just turned all the ns and other sounds like that into alphas. In other words, sounds. So that ma that's hiding in the middle of automatic is actually from the men root, even though the e and the n are both gone. But that's a pretty predictable thing in Indo-European and then specifically on into the Greek language. So automentic, what does that mean? Auto means self. Men means thinking. So if something is automatic, literally it is self-minded or spontaneous. It just happens of its own accord as though it has its own mind. Like there's not another mind who's acting on it. It's just happening and it looks like it's aware of what it's doing, whether it is or not. That's essentially the meaning of the word automatic in English. We get it. We get our word from the Greek word automatos, and you can see it there. But of course, today we use the word automatic just to mean anything that happens on its own, as if it had a mind within it, even though it probably doesn't. Otherwise, we probably wouldn't use the word automatic anymore. Another word that's very similar to that, as far as its derivation, is idiomatic. This is, of course, not as common a word as automatic in the English language, but I'm sure you're still familiar with it. What does idiomatic come from? It comes from the Greek idiomatikos. The idio part in Greek means one's own, something that is particular to one's own anything. It can be your own house, your own property, your own characteristics, your own personality. That's what the word idios means in Greek. So when you put that together with the mun root that's hiding in there, it means particular minded. So if something is idiomatic, it means it's characteristic of one's own peculiarities. It's something that you do but other people don't do, and so therefore it's idiomatic. It's something that is specific to you. So you can see the mindedness going on sort of behind the scenes there. Let's look at another important Indo-European language other than Latin and Greek. How about Sanskrit? Sanskrit is another one of the big ancient Indo-European languages that have been written down for thousands of years. Sanskrit has a derivative of the men root. I mean, it has a lot of derivatives, but there's one particular one that we have borrowed into English that I'm sure you're going to be familiar with, and that is mantra or mantra, as they would have said originally in Sanskrit. So it's from this Sanskrit word, spelled the same way, pronounced more like mantra, because they would pronounce A's more like sounds in Sanskrit. This was a sacred text to meditate on. And so today we've just kind of brought it into English as a word or a saying or even a phrase that you focus on, you meditate on, you think about. There's the thinking going on that is at the basis of this word with the men root. So that's pretty cool once you make that connection. Okay, let's switch gears a little bit and look at some words that have moan in them. In other words, they have an O there instead of an E. Now, we've already seen that Indo-European can play with that vowel a little bit. So sometimes it won't be there, as we were seeing in words like mnemonic or mnemonikos, as they would have pronounced it in Greek. But there's other things you can do with this vowel in the middle of a root in Indo-European as well. Sometimes you won't just get rid of the E, but you'll replace it with an O. And this isn't random. This happens in particular cases within the Proto-Indo-European language, and we can still tell some of those cases, in other words, why they would do this. This is one of those cases that I want to take you through really quickly here because it's going to be important to look at some moan words that we have that are definitely from the men root, even though the vowel is a little bit different. So one of the instances in which you would take the E in the middle of an Indo-European root and convert it into an O is if you want to make a causative verb out of that root. So all you have to do, it's a few very simple steps. All you do is replace the E with an O, and then you add a suffix A. So you get from the root men, you get a causative verb that's like monet something, and then you just add your verb endings, O, S, T, whatever, moneo, mones, monate, whichever the person is who's doing it, you have to conjugate it, just like most European languages today. So that's how you make a causative verb, and the way you translate it is you just cause somebody to something. So the men root means to think, so if I want to make a causative verb out of the men root, it's going to look like moan something, and it's going to mean to cause somebody to think. I'm causing you to think. And that's essentially all a causative verb is. And it's a really elegant system that you use within the Indo-European language and the daughter languages to make a causative verb. Latin has a verb, monere. They have an infinitive ending, re on the end. And that's what's going on with that extra syllable. And this means literally to cause to think, because it's just the causative of the men root. And that oftentimes evolved to mean to warn. Like if I'm warning you of something, I'm causing you to think about it. I'm saying, hey, there's a alligator behind you. You might want to think about that, right? And maybe get out of there. I'm causing you to think about something. That's what I'm doing when I'm warning you of something. So if you look in any Latin dictionary or textbook, moneo is going to be glossed as to warn, but you could also translate it to cause, to think. This verb in Latin forms a lot of compounds, and we actually borrow a lot of these compounds into English, which is why we're going to spend the rest of this safari looking at these moan compounds that we get in English. One of them is admonish. Now, you may not use the word admonish every day, but I'm sure you've come across it. Admonish, you can break up into add plus the moan root plus this ending that we don't need to worry about too much. It comes from the late Latin word admonestare, and that means to advise or to remind. The odd, you might remember this from a previous safari, and I'll put the link up here in case you haven't seen this one. The odd is a prefix in Latin that we have borrowed a lot in English. We have it on a lot of words, and it originally meant to or toward. So when you admon somebody, you're giving a warning to them. That is the idea of the odd that's going on there in admonish. And when you admonish somebody, you're just trying to cause them to reconsider something. So you can see that causative meaning is still there. Thousands of years after it was coined, even after it's been borrowed into another language, we still use it in that causative sense of trying to cause somebody to think about something, right? What's another word that has a prefix on it with the moan root? How about premonition? You probably know what a premonition is. This just comes from the Latin noun praemonitio, which has the prefix pri plus the moan root plus a noun ending, and you could also make a verb out of this as well. So in Latin, it just meant a forewarning. And today, it kind of also still means a forewarning, but we've sort of made it more specific as far as its semantics are concerned. It really means a feeling of dread about a future event. If you have a premonition that something is going to happen, usually that's a bad thing. It's about some future event or something you're going to go through or whatever. That's essentially what a premonition is. One more compound that we have in English, directly from Latin, and the word moneo in Latin is summon. Now, summon, you might be like, okay, wait a minute, what's going on with this one? How does this have to do with warning? Well, summon comes from the Latin verb summonere. Um, there is some assimilation going on here. The sum used to be sub, and so this is the prefix slash preposition sub. We get sub from this, as you can probably guess. It means under in Latin. So to submonere somebody literally means to warn somebody under. Now, what does that mean? Originally, what this would mean is you would warn somebody kind of under the table. You're not going to call them out in public. You're not going to say, hey, you did something wrong, or I'm warning you about something. The original meaning of summonere was to call somebody over privately and say, hey, I just want to let you know that maybe you're not doing the right thing and maybe you should change your ways in some way. So you're not trying to publicly shame them. You're gonna warn them under the table. And that's the original idea of summonere. Now, you can see how this could come to mean summon, because you're summoning somebody to you. You're not just going to call them out. You're saying, hey, come over here. I need to tell you something. I need to have a talk with you. I want to give you a warning or give you an admonishment or something like that. And that's where the idea of summoning that we have today, that means to authoritatively call somebody somewhere because presumably they did something wrong and you need to talk to them, comes from. Of course, we've kind of done away with the idea of privacy here, because today when you summon somebody, it may or may not be private. You could be being summoned to a private meeting, but you could be being summoned to a court case that'll be on national TV or whatever. So it may or may not be private today, but the original etymological meaning of being summoned had a sense of privacy, and doing something under the radar where most people wouldn't necessarily find out about it, and hopefully you would fix whatever you were doing. How about some other moan words that we get in English? Maybe not with prefixes at all, but just have the moan right there at the beginning. What about our word monitor? Monitor just comes from the Latin word monitor, which is spelled exactly the same way. And this originally just meant one who reminds or admonishes. Actually, we've had both of these parts here in this Safari. Moan means to warn or admonish. Tor, as you might recall from mentor, is somebody who does something. So a monitor, a monitor in Latin, literally is just a warner, a reminder, an admonisher. So that's all a monitor would be originally. Now, of course, that's still basically how we use it, but we've sort of broadened and deepened the semantic sphere of this word in English. So now it can just be one who oversees the quality of something or some group of people and fixes their errors or warns them or tells them they need to do something else. Now, the chances are pretty good that you are watching this video on something we call a monitor. Now, you might be wondering, why do we call this a monitor? It might sound a little bit creepy, like is the monitor monitoring you and making sure you do something, the right way? Actually, that's not the original meaning of it, thankfully. Nobody is monitoring you right now, as far as I know. But the original meaning of monitor is that you would use it to monitor the quality of something. In the early days of video and television, there would usually be a screen that came to be called a monitor, because it would be the thing that would warn you if the video quality was not good, so you can keep an eye on it and to see if the video quality of your broadcast or your video is okay. You're going to monitor the quality of the video broadcast. Of course, today we just use the word monitor for any kind of screen, again, like the one that you might be watching this very video on. But that's a long way from the original semantic meaning of the word monitor, which is why we take these safaris, because you just really never know where you're going to end up on some of these. What about the word monument? The word monument has the moan right there from the men root, right at the beginning. Why are they called monuments? Well, our word monument comes from the Latin word monumentum, and originally a monumentum could be anything that reminds you of something. Oftentimes it would be a physical object. It didn't have to necessarily be a physical object in Latin, although it often was. Today we've taken it over basically as a physical object, building, statue, whatever that is meant to remind people of something or someone. Of course, there can be monuments to a wide variety of things, famous people, or ideals like liberty or whatever. But that's the etymological meaning of the word monument. It makes you think about something. When you see the Statue of Liberty, it probably makes you think about liberty because it's in the name and it's very large. And if you're in New York City, you're probably going to see it, right? Okay, what else? This is something you might not see coming. How about monster? Monster actually comes from the men root and specifically from the word moneo in Latin. What does a monster have to do with thinking and specifically with causing you to think about something? This is going to be interesting because we're going to have to learn a little bit about ancient Roman and ancient Mediterranean religion for this to make sense to you. It comes from the Latin word monstrum, with this noun ending we don't really need to worry about. And originally in Latin, it didn't necessarily mean monster in our modern sense. It meant any omen or portent or sign that was sent by the gods. Now, people in the ancient Mediterranean, honestly, just like people from all around the world, have often seen their gods at work all over the place in nature. They believed that their gods were always trying to communicate with them in some way, shape, or form, and they believed that their gods would use natural occurrences to communicate with them. So, if you believe this about your gods, you need to always be watching nature to see what the gods are trying to tell you because they are trying to make you think about your life and make you do the right thing. They're trying to give you advice and warn you not to do the wrong thing because they don't completely not care about you, right? So that's the original idea of a monstrum. It's something that the gods have put in nature to warn you about something and to make you think about something and maybe to advise you about something. Now, to take the next step to get to our meaning of the word monster today, in ancient Mediterranean religions, the appearance of a strange looking animal, whether it was unusual because they didn't recognize the species or because it was like a cow that had something weird going on with it, it had two heads, it had 5 feet, I mean, whatever, it could be anything, right? I don't know if there are any two-headed cows, but whatever, you get the point. Anything weird would be considered to be a sign or a portent or an omen that was sent by the gods. It's a monstrum. It's something that the gods are sending you to warn you about something. As time went on, the semantic field of this particular word narrowed really to mean specifically animals, weird looking animals that might be sent by the gods to warn you about something. And then ultimately, once we get to modern English, we just use the word monster to mean a weird looking creature. Right? Whether we believe in God sending us omens or not, that's up to you. But we all use the word monster, regardless of what you believe about God sending you omens or messages, to mean a weird looking creature, even though the etymology of this specifically has to do with God sending warnings to mortals. All right, so that's the word monster. Pretty interesting. Of course, today we can even use it in more of a metaphorical sense. Like if you call somebody a monster, you probably mean that they are not a good person. There is something abnormal about them, and it's probably not physical. It's probably moral when you call somebody a monster. If you say somebody's a monster because they were a mass murderer or something like that, right? There can be negative moral implications to this as well. Okay, we're going to round this out by looking at two more terms that come from the Mon root that are also going to take us on a pretty interesting semantic and cultural journey, kind of like the last word did. We're going to have to go all the way back to Roman times to really understand what's going on with this one. So our word money comes from the Mon root. It has mon right there at the beginning, but you might be wondering, okay, how does this have anything to do with causing you to think about something or warning you about something? Of course, right off the bat, we do think about money a lot. A lot of people think about money a lot. It might be warning you, but the actual connection is a little bit deeper. So let's go back to Roman times. Our word money comes from the Latin word moneta, which has the mon there, plus this suffix. And moneta just means the admonisher. It's like the feminine form of monitor, actually. Moneta is a feminine admonisher. It is a feminine individual who is going to warn you of something. And the reason it's feminine is because this in particular was a title of the goddess Juno, aka Hera in Greek mythology, the queen of the gods, all right? So Juno had a number of important duties in the Roman pantheon. One of them is that she would be considered to warn you of things. I mean, all the gods would in some way, but this was a specific title that she had, moneta. Okay, that still doesn't get us to money because she wasn't necessarily the goddess of money or anything like that, but for various reasons, money was coined in Juno's temple at Rome. So the Romans didn't have a special building just for coining money that was just for money. As with most ancient Mediterranean cultures, everything was tied together with their religion and their beliefs in the gods and goddesses in some way. And so again, for various cultural reasons, they would use the temple of Juno, moneta, at Rome to coin money. They didn't really have paper money back then, so we're talking coins. They would be coining money, and you can see some examples down there in the picture, right? Roman coinage. So over time, you would call these things monetae, and that ultimately got run together thanks to the French, who dropped the T and ran everything together in Old French. That got run together to money. So money, just our word money, comes straight from moneta, which was one of Juno's titles. And we didn't borrow that word until after the Norman invasion in Middle English. However, even before that happened, we already had a word in English for money and for coinage that also came from this and was actually borrowed a lot earlier, and that is our word mint. Now, today, a mint is specifically a building where money is coined, right? Which, in that sense, actually carries over the etymological connection to moneta even better than the word money in some ways, because that was the building belonging to Juno where the money was coined. We get mint from moneta, and the T is still there because this one didn't come through French, so the French didn't get the chance to drop the T like they did with the word money. So money and mint are what we call doublets. They're the same word that have come to us through two separate etymological paths. Mint comes from moneta, but it comes from Old English. It was already there in the Old English period before we had a lot of French influence. In Old English, it was minute, and it just meant coin. That's all this word originally meant. Later on, the French borrowing money kind of encroached on its semantic sphere and took over our common word for money or coinage, and mint specifically became the word for the building or the location where the money was coined. However, as I said, this borrowing probably goes way back into our prehistoric Germanic past. This word is all over the Germanic languages, which means that it wasn't just borrowed from Latin into Old English. It was probably borrowed at a further time depth. In other words, it was probably borrowed back when our linguistic ancestors hadn't even crossed the English Channel yet. They were in Europe still. They crossed the English Channel in the 5th century. So probably prior to that, when they were still hanging out with other Germanic speakers, like speakers of Dutch and German and things like that. So they were on the continent and they came into contact with the Romans. We know that the Romans and the Germanic tribes had a lot of give and take, especially in the first 4 centuries or so of the Common Era. So this is probably the period when this word was coined, no pun intended, because the Germanic speakers came into contact with the Romans. The Romans showed them coins because it's not clear the Germanic speakers would have had coins in their culture. They probably weren't minting anything because they didn't have mints. They didn't have places to mint them. So they would have shown them coins and traded coins with them. And so the Germanic speakers would have needed to have a word for these coins, and they just took the Roman word. The Romans were calling them monetae, and so they just called them monetae, or the closest they could get. And this is the origin of the Old English word minute, which ultimately got run together to mint. Ironically, once the Norman invasion happened and the French language sort of permeated English culture, we borrowed a doublet of it as money, which is basically what we call this today, even though we still have both of these terms. And all of that ultimately comes from the Mon root, even though, again, you have to go on quite a semantic journey to really understand what's going on here, because you wouldn't really guess that money and mint have anything to do with the Men root, but etymologically, they do. There is a connection there. All right, we're going to end there. There are certainly other words that we could bring in, except as usual, I didn't want to make this too long. So if there's anything else you're interested in or anything else that you can think of that comes from the Men root, go ahead and comment below. See you next time.